I'm really excited to introduce everyone. There's, I guess I should also say there's a little bit of a narrative that I lightly tried to put on this. So the idea of speculative maps, well, the first panelist, and we'll have Megan from Little Giants, who's going to be talking about this project, A Dream Deferred. There was an exhibit over on Spring Garden, and also a series of community conversations. It's really great. I hope you got to see it. But that project, to me, was sort of speculating about the past. What did the past look like geographically, and how does it resonate today? Then we're going to move on to Lori Allen. Penn people may know her as the Digital Scholarship Director over in the library. She's also the Research Director for the Monument Lab project, which was equally exciting. And so one of the ideas that project asked people to think about what would an appropriate monument for the city of Philadelphia right now. So that's sort of speculating about the present. And then we'll move on to Rashida Phillips. And I was Rashida is an Afrofuturist and a public interest attorney, but also an Afrofuturist public interest attorney. And I think that's an important, that's important. It's not like a day job and a night job. And I've been trying to follow the Afrofuturist affair since I came to Philadelphia. And this seemed like a really, I read an article in, what was it? Yeah, Funambulist. Afrofuturism is, of course, interested in a timeline, but Rashida was talking about how time and space aren't just two different vectors. They overlap, and the way we talk about time and space can be very similar. So I thought Rashida would be an interesting person to think through speculating about future geographies. I've said way too much by way of introduction, so I just want to hand it off to Megan. Thank you so much.
Use this, or?
Did we figure out, does the clicker work?
Does the clicker work? Okay. Hi, my name is Megan Denenberg, and I just want to give a qualifier that I have my own story around this, but this has to be a presentation, so I might be a little disjointed, but I was given note cards, and so hopefully we'll be in good shape, so bear with me. So my company is called Little Giant Creative. We are a three-pronged organization where our primary focus is creative, where we develop strategies around connecting our clients with their audiences. The second is about social impact initiatives that we develop and are proprietary that really revolve around equitable development and equity in general. And the last one is my partner and I are also co-founders of Pipeline Workspace, co-working space in Center City. So we've sort of been launched into the real estate world, and we have a holding company that also really revolves around equitable development. And this is what I'm saying is in presentations, sometimes I'll just speed by, or I won't even, I think I had a presentation where I didn't even go to a slide until at the end, and that didn't work very well. So this presentation is about our interactive exhibit called A Dream Deferred, which focused on redlining, but also the racist policies that were systemic that prevented people of color from land ownership, and subsequently really challenged our progression towards a sustainable lifestyle. But before we get to that, I just have to give a little background of who we are, because at the end of the day, this is about how data, and I think the power of storytelling and the power of qualitative information really works together, I think, to tell much more of a holistic story and to bring back the humanity of numbers. And so the creative agency in a lot of ways is why the storytelling was is part and parcel of everything that we do, and I think it's a very integral part of things that we do. My partner and I, we have an agency that's 100% minority owned and operated, and our staff is majority people of color. Through that lens, we're very often asked to develop strategies around how to compel a younger audience and how to compel more diverse audience. And in the very obsolete world, or in the obsolete world of marketing, that's called multicultural marketing. I've never actually understood that, because to me, multicultural marketing, what does that assume general marketing is? So general marketing to us is multicultural marketing. And so all of our initiatives have really been framed around that structure. And because our agency is comprised of the people to whom we're talking to, all of our communications are very, well, I believe, are very authentic. And these are just a few examples of people we work with. Right now, Megan Denenberg, Grace Shin, project manager, she put together these slides. And does so much more. That was very marginalizing, sorry. Okay, what we do, I just kind of explained it, but I have to say that a lot of our work is driven by the observations that my partner and I have made, frankly, very often being the only people of color in rooms that are always talking about trying to attract people of color. And so, really, at the end of the day, our agency seems to be focused around cultural competency and creating a much more inclusive lens, because we know that this world still operates in a way where it feels as if we're in a John Hughes film, and it doesn't necessarily represent, I think, the men and women who are actually living in this world now. And I'm sorry if a lot of you are too young to reference John Hughes, but Pretty in Pink and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Why this matters. I think this is the most important slide to me. There are two facts that, to me, is creating sort of this dystopian worldview that I have and makes me feel like I'm walking down the street in a dystopian world sometimes. Within the next 50 years, two things are known to be going to happen. I can't say they're going to be true. Things could happen. You never know. But right now, we're on this trajectory. The first is we're going to be a minority majority. I mean, frankly, more babies of color have been born than white babies for the last 2 or 3 years. And then secondly, by 2030, 2 out of 3 people will be living in cities. And so when we look at the cities that we're living in, and when we're looking at the city centers, especially, you know, my partner and I are obsessed with cities, so we go to a lot of cities, we talk about this stuff a lot. And really just in our own backyard, when you're walking down Center City in Philadelphia, which a lot of people consider to be our city, I often wonder, you know, where people of color have gone or where they're going. And so this matters. Okay, it's jumping around a bit, but it will make sense eventually. The vertical that we created in order to, I think, manifest a lot of our observations was Creative Cities Lab. And really, what we believe and what drives most of our initiatives, our proprietary initiatives that we've developed, is the communication historically has been very exclusionary. Language and jargon and the way things are taught don't necessarily compel, I think, the contemporary landscape or the contemporary peoplescape of cities. And so I've always tried to figure out, how do we create more accessible and more contemporary programs that compel a wider net of people to want to engage and to understand about topics that are really important to them, but always seem to be talked about. And I'm very sorry, because I'm not usually in academic echo chambers, but in academic echo chambers. Okay. And then to go back to the minority majority and back to most people living in cities. The one thing that we've noticed in a lot of our interactions with people and with some of the businesses and entrepreneurs with whom we work is that there seems to be a premium around welcoming spaces and in fact, in our creative world, a lot of institutions are coming to us asking about how to make their institutions a lot more, I think, welcoming to a wider net of people, because the world has changed. People, instead of looking down, people instead of looking up, are looking down. And to ask people to come to you is a little bit of an outdated and antiquated idea. And so the idea is, how do you go to people? And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of measures haven't been taken in order to do that. And this is a really nice infographic about what we feel communication, really how communication needs to be thought, about how it needs to be culturally connective, of how it needs to be accessible, and how we need to understand that some communication that has existed for thousands of years is very repellent today to a wide group of people. And so we tried to create common languages, and that's where we're going into. I hope the next slide is about a dream deferred. Okay. So it is. So this gives a little bit of the history, and I'm going to tell you, this is where I'm going to freestyle a little bit. So, although I've been freestyling the whole time. But my partner and I have conversations all the time, and I would have to say, because we sort of feel like we're living in a dystopian world, we had these angry rants every morning. And so a couple of years ago, my partner came in and we started talking about redlining. And, after our kind of, 10 to 20-minute rant, he said something really interesting, which is, what would this city be like if redlining hadn't existed? And to me, I thought that was amazing, and I do what I always do, which is sit down and I try to create strategies and programs and initiatives around things that just are so unjust, or that I think could really work in ways to disseminate information, because one of the things that he and I always talk about is how little known a lot of the history of this country is to the people who need to know it the most. And so we did a whole bunch of research, and does everybody know what redlining is? Okay, wow, so I'm preaching to the choir anyway. But I think what's interesting about redlining is that what a lot of people, and I think this room probably does, but there isn't that automatic leap about redlining, which is, it is the systematic and systemic way of othering people, period. And, I mean, clearly, making sure that, there's no real sustainable progression of moving forward, making sure that only a small group of people have access to resources and real estate, that's clear. But when you look at the actual levels of the coding, the color coding, Mexican Americans were actually number 10, African Americans were number 9, and in fact, there were the right white people and there were the wrong white people. And to us, that information is intensely important, because it really speaks to how there is a construct of an alignment with a power structure that has allowed the rest of us to kind of always scramble for crumbs and to have a lot of, I think, non-intersectionality and always feel good as long as we're doing better than someone else. And frankly, the consequences of redlining, and it isn't the consequences of redlining, because redlining wasn't the first of its kind to happen. These type of practices have been in existence from the very beginning, but I think what the most interesting thing is, and you all probably know this better than I do, is that we all know Andrew Jackson was evil, right? He created this incredibly horrific environment post-Civil War that created a lot of African American deaths, and no accountability for the people who had done wrong, which was almost everyone. But what we don't realize is that Reconstruction, which we all know is completely riddled with problems, there were communities that were starting to be integrated. And they were actually working well. And so the federal government, with the wonderful New Deal, looked at this and kind of developed, again, this is my personal perspective, but it is based on history, is that how do we eradicate that? How do we figure out ways to make sure that this integration doesn't happen? And redlining was only one of the many policies and the many practices that were developed in order to desegregate and create an entire structure where people of color were not able to buy land, period. So what was really important to us also about this is that a lot of people are affected, that intersectionality, the completely wave of othering. And how could we make that into something where it becomes a welcoming space that provides empathy or empathic ways of conversations and discourse, and provides a way for people to contextualize it themselves. So nobody felt challenged, nobody felt burdened, but you could take the information and then you could contextualize it into your own history and unpack whether your family or whether you have been burdened or benefited from these policies. And so really at the end of the day, that's why I created this program the way that it was created. It is an interactive exhibit. It had a lot of different platforms because we know that people understand things differently. We know people absorb things differently. And to us, to me, I kept thinking, okay, touch technology, because everybody is always on their phones or always on their computers and they're looking for God or they're looking for something in it. And I wanted to use that platform because that is a very contemporary way that people are absorbing information. But we also know that, some people are turned off by the computer outside of workspace. I don't know that many people, but I'm sure there are a few. And decided, we also needed to create different levels of how to get that information. And so we developed a documentary. We had an analog art component that reimagined Philadelphia as if redlining hadn't existed. That was a little tricky because I don't think anyone can. And then we had a reflection booth for people to be able to go in quietly and reflect on how they absorb that information. The way that we designed the exhibit specifically was to make sure there was no feeling of exit at the gift shop. We wanted people to be able to come in, be able to sit down and absorb the information in the time that they needed, the way that they needed, and not to feel pressured in any way. We had a wonderful docent program where we worked with men and women from different communities to be able to interact and really answer questions, but at the end of the day, the experience was left to the attendee. It wasn't left for us to craft it for you. And these are the components that I just talked about. I told you I'm not really good with presentations. The one thing that I did leave out was we had a reading room because, again, part of that welcoming space, and also to understand that there was a lot of narrative and a lot of information that informed this exhibit. We had a library of sorts and a big table where people could just sit, go to our cafe, and then come back and read some of the books that really informed the exhibit. So the interactive touchscreens were interesting. We worked with a crazy number of partners because at the end of the day, a lot of the initiatives that I craft, it can't be about me or about my company, and it can't be ego-driven. And so we reached out to a bunch of people and got this incredible ecosystem of people that worked on this exhibit with us. The interactive touchscreen was the result of 4 or 5 groups of historians that did all the archival research. Then we worked with a GIS and a touchscreen technologist, 2 separate organizations. And we all worked together in order to get the product that we got. what we really wanted to do, in my mind, what we really wanted to do is I wanted to create this huge screen that everyone would be able to work at the same time and be able to go into every single neighborhood and find out everything that happened to make that neighborhood look the way that it is. I was very quickly shot down, and so we ended up with 3 individual screens that people could interact with. And on the screens were routes, because we really wanted to personalize and customize this again so people could feel the experience of going through neighborhoods and understanding why the neighborhoods are the way that they are. And so we landed on, because we knew that we couldn't hit every single neighborhood, we landed on the West Philly student, the Mount Airy family, Kensington commuter, Hawthorne nature lover, and North Philly night out. And basically what it did is it dives deeply into the route, the area where you are as you're going through the route. And with that, because we were very mindful of contemporary language and jargon, we made sure that we had a glossary of terms so that people would understand, because there's so many acronyms in this game, that people would understand even the baseline definitions of the topics that we were talking about, but also some of the more intense. We wanted to make sure that it was at different levels. And then at the side of the map, which was the only part that was interactive, there was an entire timeline. So if you didn't even have time to engage with the map, you could go through the entire timeline from the New Deal. I mean, we started a little bit before the New Deal, but the New Deal to contemporary day, to see, to not only see the policies, but to understand some of the stories, the human aspect stories of people who are affected by these policies as well. And this just gives a screenshot of an example of one of the routes that we made. I think, yeah, I was supposed to talk about the timeline here, but we already talked about that. And then the glossary of terms came at the bottom, so everything that had a yellow line underneath it, you could touch on it, and then it gave the definition of what it was. Oh, it's a video?
Yeah, it's just this is sped up, but
Okay.
just a sample of a simulation. So imagine the cursor actually being your finger, and as you go through the route, the timeline actually shifts, and that would be the glossary of terms. So very sped up, but just for the sake of time. And clearly, like in West Philly, the MOVE bombing was one of the historical events that we touched on.
Okay, I think it's stalled now.
It was really quick.
No,
Sake
it's
of time.
stalled. Okay. And then I'll try to really make this much quicker now. And at the end of the day, when we were when I was working with the team to develop the exhibit and create the exhibit, we realized, we knew we had to have a little bit of programming. I didn't want to have too much because I think it tends to be overwhelming, because I think a lot of the content, there's so much content, and I think the exhibit was so rich in many ways that we wanted to, again, of course, let the person sort of, create their own experience. But we did want to have a little bit of programming, and we created this panel discussion series that really got to the heart, I think, of what this program is about and what I think about constantly, which is how do we battle the myth of meritocracy? And, they're very place-based panel discussions. We've had them in different areas of the city, and they've really taken kind of the arc of what I think meritocracy is, of which one of the most important thing is about implicit bias, which was our last one. It tackles it in a way that we really wanted to create an arc and a story about that myth. And the post-exhibit reflections, I mean, we had close to 1,000 visitors. We were only open for 2 months. I have to say, we did a pretty intensive evaluation with this incredible organization called Thicket. And we had about 600 evaluation forms filled out on site. And we realized that the people who came had an intense diversity of backgrounds and came from almost every single zip code, and zip codes actually outside of the region. From what we've heard, they've had, had generally very positive experiences. And I do have to say the one thing that was really interesting is we wanted to make sure that the content and the information was not skewed towards just one narrative. The narrative of this country includes a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. And so our documentary and the information in the touchscreen technology included, the incredible racist practices that occurred against Asian Americans. We talked about the Puerto Rican narrative and the racist policies that occurred against them. And we also acknowledged that we had a very small sliver of history, and we couldn't hit every marginalized community in this country and in this world. But I do feel that because of the intersectionality of this otherness and the intersectionality of feeling and being deprived of the access to resources, really opened up the exhibit to welcome a really large group of people. And the most gratifying to us was the fact that we had requests from third graders, from people, teachers of third graders, up to postgraduate, up to community groups requesting almost daily to have a tour. And I think it really resonated, and we received a lot of information from people who had never heard of redlining and who hadn't realized the benefits that they were actually inheriting moving into cities. And to us, that was an incredibly important component as well. And so you just heard 15 minutes of my voice, and I apologize. But that's it. Cool.
I'm really excited to be here and on this panel. As Stuart said, I work as a librarian here at Penn, and Monument Lab is sort of a kind of borderline passion project for me, though the research we did absolutely relied on collaboration from the Price Lab for Digital Humanities and the library where I work. But as I said, to some extent, Monument Lab is a side gig for me. Monument Lab is a national public art and history project based in Philadelphia. Our goal is to critically engage the monuments we have inherited and unearth the next generation of monuments through stories of social justice and solidarity. We work with artists, activists, municipal agencies, and civic stakeholders on creative approaches to public art, history, and memory. Through art exhibitions, participatory projects, a National Fellows Program, and a new website and podcast, which is amazing, Monument Lab is building research and creative conversations around the past, present, and future of monuments. So I'm representing Monument Lab, which is doing lots of awesome work. My colleague, Paul Farber, is in Pittsburgh right now dreaming up cool things with some of the people you actually heard Shannon talking about earlier. And the work of our group continues, but I'm not really going to talk about most of that ongoing work in this conversation. Instead, I'm going to describe our work in the 2017 citywide exhibition, and even more specifically, I'm going to talk most about the research part of that work. And I'm going to tell the story of that 2017 exhibition 3 times. First, just as an overview, so you'll know what I'm talking about, and for some of you, this will be like the 10th time you've heard this overview, so there it is. Second, I'll take a little bit more time to talk about the methods we used and what we learned, especially as it allows us to imagine a different kind of map of Philadelphia or a different kind of city or civic data. And then third, I'm going to talk about the things that remained unsettled for me in the project, the questions that I don't quite have answers to. I can't move forward without acknowledging the giant group of people who contributed to this project, most notably, of course, Paul Farber, the artistic director, and Ken Lum, who's here at Penn and the chief curatorial advisor, and then a whole lot of other people. Also, very importantly, the nearly 100 people who worked at the labs as part of the project. And you'll see pictures of some of them, and you'll hear some of their names as we go through. But I want to especially call out, as this is a project about the research, the data team listed there at the bottom, Heather, Cydia, Ian, and Aileen, whose work I am very much representing here. And also Yannick Trapman-O'Brien, who went back through all of their work and corrected a lot of typos and their kind of emergency on-the-spot work, as you'll hear about later. So And then also this project was done in collaboration with Mural Arts Philadelphia, so I want to acknowledge them, and just for good measure, the advisory committee. So take one, Monument Lab, started in 2012, but was publicly started as a discovery phase in the City Hall courtyard, with this class sculpture of an empty classroom by the late Terry Adkins that sat in the center of the City Hall courtyard in answer to this question, what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? We also asked that question at a nearby learning lab, a different kind of classroom, where we invited the public, residents, people who walked by, to fill out this form. In answer to the question, we gathered 455 proposals in those 3 weeks in 2015, and then moved to a citywide exhibition whose goal was to change the way we write the history of our city together. It was 10 weeks in the fall of 2017. 1 year ago, it just ended. So here you can see that project had 10 locations. City Hall was the first one in the first project, and in this project we had 10 locations with 20 artists. And here you can see a board that we worked on during the development. And here's an easier to view map of the 10 locations. So 20 artists, 10 locations, 5 public parks in Center City, and 5 neighborhood squares. And here is a very brief view of the 20 works of temporary prototype monuments created by the artists, and I'll talk about some of them a little bit later on, but basically at or around 10 city parks. At each of those 10 sites was a lab, open 4 days a week and staffed by a lab manager, generally an artist, community activist, or organizer, and 2 high school students, all of whom were paid. They engaged in conversations with the public. At the lab, we used a form that I'll show in a moment, and you'll see a lot of times over the course of this presentation, but you can see it there on the table where people were asked to fill out this form. When they were finished, they gave it to the lab staff member who they were usually chatting with at the time. The lab staff member would go back to that corner and scan the form, and it would become data. The data went to our data team, who mapped, transcribed, and analyzed the proposals as they came in. The mapped proposals were then shown on a map that was displayed at the back of the labs on that screen there. And this is basically what it looked like. And by basically, I mean this is exactly what it looked like. The proposals were also shown at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. In a museum, they were shown on a constant loop that we updated over the course of the project as new proposals came in. The collection of proposals is now housed in the Kislak Center here in the library at Penn. And the data is available as an open data set alongside city data and official statistics in Open Data Philly. We also presented just last month our findings from the research, basically what we learned at City Hall. We gave a presentation to the city managers. This included like the fire commissioner and the chief of the public art office and about 100 other people who run departments I hadn't even heard of in the city of Philadelphia. It was the most surreal presentation I've ever given. Like, it was amazing. Oh, where are the newspapers? I brought in a stack of newspapers. Kenny, are they under my chair? Sorry, I forgot about that, because this is the next slide. So thanks, I have the newspapers. So the report was also distributed to every branch library in the free library system, and this is the cart taking them, and to every office in City Hall. We delivered a stack of the newspapers. So that's Monument Lab. And like I said, I was the research director, which means I was working mostly on developing the system that would help us gather those 4,500 proposals and learn from them so that they could be made into these collections, data sets, and report. So take 2. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the decisions that we made. And first, I'll start with those 5 sites. The first 5 sites, there were the neighborhood squares in the center city, and we saw they were placed, here you see them on the 1683 map plan. So when William Penn started colonizing the land of the Lenni and Lenape people in the 17th century, he made a plan for a green country town. And the way that he carved up the landscape in that plan is the same way that the maps of Center City show today. And so when rethinking the monuments, in some ways, the streets themselves are a monument to this colonial project. And Penn's planners built in 5 public squares to the city fabric, one in the center and one in each corner of the city as it was then. In the center is where we now have City Hall, and each of the other 4 still have some life as public spaces, parks that are recognizable there. So Monument Lab started in those 5 and then moved out to 10 neighborhoods. These are pictures I took on my phone the first day of Monument Lab of all the lab staff. So they were just new to their spots. They hadn't really made them all their own yet. And here is the form where we asked people to share their ideas in answer to the question. As you can see, we asked them to name their monuments, to place them at an address or location in the city where they thought their monument should go. We asked them to write or sketch their idea. They were also asked if they would be willing to share their home zip code and age, in addition to a name or social media handle if they wanted their credit for their idea. And as I said, it was immediately turned into data and transcribed and analyzed. But it was very important to us that the collection of the data happen in person. We're talking about monuments. They are in public space and they happen in person. Most monuments in public, and our project took place in public parks. So we used to get questions about like, do you have trolls, right? If the data goes right in, and the answer is when someone is handing an idea to another person, generally they're a lot more respectful than they might be if they're leaving comments on a public website from the kind of comfort and safety and strange cruelty of their computer screens. So handing the paper in person was an important part of it to us. Overall, as I mentioned, we got 4,445 proposals. Each one is now in Open Data Philly. And here you can see where they all are in the city. This picture is in the report, and I'll come back to the report in a minute to talk about it. But before I do that, before I talk about the themes in the report and what we found, I'm actually going to show random, and these are actually random, like I took screenshots from a random generator of proposals on our website. Because I want to show the variety of the ways people engage with this question is really worth considering. 4,445 people spent time sitting in public with a pen and paper, taking time to answer this question. I could stop on any of these pages and talk about these proposals. We heard from people about what they wanted to see in our shared spaces, what they imagine should exist, what they imagine we should remember from the past, and what they want the future to remember about the present. And one thing that's really amazing that doesn't fit in elsewhere is how many people already had ideas. Like if you asked me this question, I don't know, but we asked thousands of people this question, and some of them had been carrying an idea around for a monument for decades. They were ready. And then some people rejected the question altogether. They saw us as people who at least had enough power to get a shipping container and a work of art into their park, and they told us what they wish the city spent its money on instead. And so I'm going to talk about the findings from this research, and I will stand behind those findings. I really believe that we did find those things, and I believe this data is unbelievably valuable as a data source, but I didn't want to go too far into the data without just showing the sheer variety. So as we thought about trying to make sense of the data as a data set, one way was just to notice how many people's public proposals were along the same themes as the artist's work. This is the work of Dwayne Linklater. He's from the Moose Creek Cree Nation, and he took a line that was supposed to be the length of the treaty between William Penn and the Lenape Nation and asked his daughter to write it, and it was in neon above the Delaware River, which, as you can see, is still flowing, and yet our treaty with the Lenape that was formed at that Penn Treaty Park does not seem to still hold. Here's Alvin Jones, who had the same idea for Penn Treaty Park, and I'll point out, you can see from this corner that it says CH246. That's our little code, and it means that this proposal was offered at City Hall. So it wasn't offered at Penn Treaty Park where there was a proposal. It was offered at City Hall. Here's another person. This person made their proposal for Malcolm X Park in West Philly and wanted to replace a monument at Penn's Landing, which is probably a half mile or so down the road from Penn Treaty Park. Another person wanting to call attention to monuments to the specific tribes and communities who were here before. Another work of art that had a huge number of proposals that were along the same theme was Sharon Hayes, who was expressing her frustration with the lack of monuments to women in Philadelphia. This is her piece. I love the title. It is called "If They Should Ask," and engraved on the outside are the names of women to whom there should be monuments in Philadelphia. There are, somehow the number escapes me, and I've said this quote so many times, but it's like 1,500 or 2,000 monuments in the city of Philadelphia on public land. 2 of them are to women, if you don't count like Justice is not an actual woman. 2 of them are to women. One of them is Joan of Arc, who's not from Philly. And one of them is Mary Dwyer, who's from Boston, which is also not Philly, just so we're clear. This is women's rights. This one, City of Sisterly Love, more specific, Alice Paul, Nellie Bly, and Billie Holiday. And this one, we had 2 proposals that asked for a monument to Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I like this one. She's from Philly, created rock and roll, and was also a QWOC, queer woman of color. The idea is for SRT jamming out on her guitar. And I want to call attention to the location here, somewhere with a lot of foot traffic, so people know who she is. So we had a data team who got that and had to put that on a map. They had to place that as a point on a map. There is no dot on the map for that. So her proposal is in the data set and it has coordinates, but there's a bit of a lie about that, about the way we had to squeeze Becca's idea into a dot on the map, or any of these locations, which were also offered. Our data team did the best they could to honor people's wishes while never giving any proposal more than one location. But for me, this just calls out how much more complex our imagined map of our imagined city is than the maps on our screens, and how much reality and truth is compromised in so many kinds of public data sets. We wanted a data set that included people's unwillingness to use this form, their eagerness to break it. We wanted an interface that would allow all of the complex imaginations of people's thoughts. And the interface we ended up with was actually more a way of doing things, paper, pen, conversation, than a highly technical project, though there was a little bit of back end to it. And then just along the same theme, here are some of the ages that didn't fit very nicely into, lots of people left age blank, but I like the people who were like, it is not your business. And again, these sort of challenge your data. But we did try to make a report, and we did. And Paul likes to remind people that nobody asked us for this report. It's not like we were like assigned, please write a report for the city of Philadelphia. But once we said we're going to produce a report, there was a like, where's your report? And Paul threatened, and I don't know if he was joking, but I love it. He was like, maybe the report's a parade. But we did make it. We looked through the forms and spent a huge amount of time with the data, sorting, searching, cleaning up, messing up, and moving it and examining it. And we can offer some themes. First, about the kinds of monuments people proposed. Many people proposed statues and sculptures, but there were also hundreds of proposals for murals, for digital and interactive monuments, and for other forms of remembering. I want to spend a couple of minutes focusing on the 4 themes that emerged from our analysis. I'll go through them one by one, but they are rethinking common knowledge, craving representation, seeking connection with others, and reflecting on process and power. Common knowledge. Philadelphians possess a vast knowledge of the historic city's past and present that we should draw on to enrich our civic monumental landscape. I was amazed by how much this city knows about its own history, how much history is there. So, for example, this proposal celebrated the Heath brothers, jazz musicians from Point Breeze. This one called for a monument to the Underground Railroad, and more specifically to William Still, who recorded stories from people who had escaped enslavement and made it to Philadelphia. Other people sought recognition for movements rather than individuals, and some people played with Philadelphia's well-known tropes, like our charming propensity to save parking spots. This is a giant list of people who were mentioned as deserving of monuments. And I sort of, in my mind, this list is like our if they should ask, though I don't know that Elon Musk needs a monument in Philadelphia. The second theme, which is perhaps the most obvious one, people want monuments that are not to white men. We already knew that, but in case evidence is needed, we heard this one overwhelmingly. And this was a fun thing to say in City Hall. Like, we don't need any more information about whether this is desired. We know enough. We have now data. 4,500 proposals tell us. So some people just said it straight out, while others called out particularly problematic areas, like, for instance, the fact that Norris Square is named after a man who enslaved people in a neighborhood that is largely Puerto Rican. There were calls to honor victims of gun violence and to honor teachers, and in this case, to honor people with disabilities and patients in medical care. Generally, I think this 16-year-old summed it up best by saying, "I'm just tired of white statues everywhere." The next theme is about connection. As we said in the report, people yearn for monuments that signal hope for solidarity across lines formed by historic injustice and division. I think the evidence for this yearning is partially in just how many people participated in this project. But there were so many to hand-holding, and I'm going to kind of skip through them. And then the last was calls for reflections on process and power. Philadelphians understand monuments as part of existing structures of power, and they seek ways to experiment and engage in democracy and public space. In some cases, they just called for more listening. Other people wanted social services or to call out the ways that our society allocates resources. Some people commented on existing monuments, but overall, the proposals in this theme spoke to the power of monuments and the conversations they spark to help us contend with the ways that our history, our environment, our systems and structures are all intertwined. Altogether, the big takeaway from this report is that there is a lot of potential in the data, but there's also a lot of potential in the enthusiasm and perspectives of people in Philadelphia to think about concrete and creative ways to approach and address problems. So this is the very end, take 3, the kind of closing. As I said, the data is now a CSV, a GeoJSON, and a shapefile in our city's open catalog of data. It resides along with bike routes and crime rates. And we have a website where people can explore the data on their own. And I'll just show a couple of visualizations that we tried to make before I conclude. Here is a visualization about the topics we saw by the neighborhood of the proposer. So we used that zip code data. As you can see, and this is all in the newspaper, which you guys should take. As you can see, residents from the Northeast talked a lot about unity, where in Southwest Philadelphia, a lot of people called specifically, for monuments to African Americans. The River Wards, Northern Liberties, Fishtown, and up to Kensington a little were very into the environment and maybe a little less into African Americans. Love showed up everywhere, but North Philadelphia sees the biggest call for love. I can show you that that's there, and this one, where we actually took the zip codes that had the highest number of proposals, like, where 19143, which is in West Philly, has this one, and looked at what were the themes that emerged from those. This is a map of proposers by age range. I'm not going to talk about this one either because I'm running out of time, but this one was but I'm going to show, because this is about maps, I'm going to show one that I used to talk about all the time before the 2017, when we only had those 455 from 2015. But when we talk about speculative maps, this is one of my favorite proposals, and I feel like I need to share this one. This is from the 2015 project. This person took the proposal form home with them, copied a map of Philadelphia onto it, made a monument to the horses that built Philadelphia. If you can see, over here it says, as we walk around the city, the ground plane dominates our visual cone. So the idea is you're walking around, and that horse is like between buildings. So you're walking and you just see an outline. But actually, if you see from above, you can see the horses that built Philadelphia. And so I think to some degree, that's just sort of the thing. The proposals are works of art. They don't make sense without the works created by the artists, like this Revolutionary War monument boxed up in mirrors by Karen Olivier, or the pick sitting in the concrete at the Municipal Services Building by Hank Willis Thomas, or without the people who made this happen. And I'm going to close, actually, this is really embarrassing, but I have to show a different slide because that has my notes on it. It's this one. Sorry. So to close, I want to come back to this notion of research and of data and of how I think of this research process. I care a lot about these proposals, as you can probably see, and I think it's really valuable to share the patterns that emerge. But I also see the project as an intervention of public speculative data into the city's open data infrastructure. I hope that it challenges some of the calls for data-driven decision-making that assumes that data is somehow more real than other ways of knowing. Because to some extent, Monument Lab is about trying to change the way some kinds of decisions are made. If I say we have data representing people's ideas, and yet we are the ones who pose the questions, what does that say about the data? I love open data, and yet in so many cases, people celebrate data-driven decisions without acknowledging who's setting the terms of those decisions, who is gathering and using this data. This data set of imagined data is designed to throw a wrench into easy data analysis. Technically, it works. It's well-formatted CSV and GeoJSON files, but it sits in Open Data Philly as a way to undermine it a bit, to inspire people to think about all of the kinds of data we are not gathering and the ways of knowing that these data gathering habits can hide or ignore. It is designed to call out how much our data gathering, like our historic monument building, is always tied to powerful agendas and is not neutral, nor can it be. And then I'm going to steal 30 more seconds to play, because I can't resist. So this is Emeka Ugbo, a Nigerian sound artist based in Berlin. He collaborated with the poet Ursula Rucker on a piece for a Monument Lab called Logan Square that played on top of the rooftop for the Free Library and on listening stations in Logan Circle. It featured a monumental poem, which is 12 minutes long. I'm not going to play the whole thing, by Ursula Rucker called Ode to Philly, which is probably my favorite thing. And so I'm going to play a 30-second clip to close.
Like a bell named Liberty, let freedom ring. Even though cracked, she still manages to sing. Her sound resonates both far and wide, demonstrates how to be broken but still have pride.
Okay, thank you.
I'm a housing attorney. I work at Community Legal Services, and I manage our landlord-tenant work. So I do a lot of different work around housing, eviction defense, tenant protections, preservation of affordable housing policy, all those kinds of different things. But I'm also a science fiction writer, author, artist here in a city that does a number of different socially engaged art projects and writing projects and things like that. Primarily working through a collective called Black Quantum Futurism, which consists of myself and my partner, More Mother, who's a musician and artist as well. And I also have created here the Afrofuturist Affair back in 2011, which is a kind of an event-based platform that used to do an annual event called the Afrofuturist Affair Charity and Costume Ball that we're not doing anymore, but we're doing other things that are just as cool. So I want to kind of talk about the perspective, kind of how through my work I approach this idea of maps. I'm really interested in maps from a number of different perspectives. So just going to talk about our approach to mapping and then some different projects that we've engaged in that uses maps in different ways. First, one of the questions that we always ask, and we actually ask a set of questions that I'll talk about later when we approach maps, are thinking about what is being mapped, questioning the assumptions that we make when we look at a map. I think often we take maps for granted that what they're presenting is a reality, but in many ways it's not reality. It's a representation of someone's version of reality. And there's a lot of things that are embodied and embedded in maps that, again, we don't always question the assumptions that were made in the map, and we kind of see it as something that's objective. But we see all maps as subjective. We also think about the ways in which maps embody different times. Really, primarily, my collective is focused on this idea of time, and the way in which we approach Afrofuturism is through the realm of time. So thinking about the ways in which Afrofuturistic practices modify time, take us out of this kind of linear, sort of causal past, present, and future that is very strict, and how most of us, especially in Western societies, kind of move through or think about or react within time. So with a map itself, a map is embodied embodying and representing a bunch of fused kinds of space times. Just as much as we talk about time and the sort of words that are associated with time are some of the most used words in our language. But we have this tendency to spatialize time when we talk about it. So we see, time as the future as ahead of us. We tend to see the past as behind us. We tend to engage in something called linguistic space-time mapping when we're talking about time, and again, seeing it as a location, as something to be arrived in. And so when you're looking at a map, and also just the way in which science itself has kind of fused space-time in these different ways. So when you're looking at a map, it's embodying and all of these kind of intersecting temporal and conflicting, often temporal domains. So there's kind of the pasts of the map, so whatever, the past in which the map was made, the past that it might be representing. It's in some ways, it maps the present, it embodies the present of the map terrain, and then it embodies the future of all these kinds of events and the futures of who's using the map in all of these different ways. And they interact and they're fused together as this kind of like overlay of any map that you're kind of looking at. So just depending on what's being mapped and who's doing the mapping, things are going to look different, of course, as we all know, and it's going to embody certain assumptions. So the maps that I have up here are part of the Sharswood neighborhood, which is located in North Philadelphia. We're very close to where I live. I also live in North Philly. And I've done a lot of work in that particular community, and I'll talk about one project in particular, space that I created called Community Futures Lab, and I'll talk more about that later. But just to talk about what's happening in this area of the city. This is an area of the city that has largely been disinvested. It's very close to Temple University. It's in some ways close to Center City. It's in some ways prime real estate, but it's been largely neglected for many years, and there's a history there and a trajectory. But in the present, what they talk about in this community, all they talk about is, how blighted it is, how it's one of the highest crime rates. It's one of the biggest poverty rates in the city. And so about 2 or 3 years ago, the city came together with the Philadelphia Housing Authority, because there's also a lot of concentrated public housing in this area, and created a redevelopment plan for this neighborhood. And that redevelopment plan included taking by eminent domain, which is a process where the government can essentially take your property, offer you some value for it, for a public good purpose. They took 1,300 properties by eminent domain in this very small area, the area that's up top there. So that's, and in addition to taking those properties from homeowners and from business owners and other people, and a lot of them were vacant and blighted as well, but a lot of them weren't. They also demolished a lot of public housing. So they demolished 2 towers that were there that had public housing families housed, and a bunch of low rises in that area. So again, this kind of like mapping and how maps are used to kind of take property, also to, in some ways, displace people, even though they're being offered the opportunity 10 years later to kind of come back after they build $500,000 properties and create what they're calling a mixed income kind of neighborhood. So again, how maps are used and what assumptions are being embodied. And then at the same time in this neighborhood, this neighborhood sits right next to Brewery Town. And if anybody's familiar with Brewery Town and what's happening there, it's being very rapidly gentrified. And I live in Brewery Town and am witnessing it with my own eyes. And I've lived in North Philly for a long time. And so every month I'm very involved in our zoning committee there in our local neighborhood group. Every month we get at least 5 or 6 applications that are using maps to take this neighborhood and take these properties and turn them into luxury housing, which then pushes people, low-income people, and people who have lived in these neighborhoods for many decades and in some cases all of their lives, pushing them out of the neighborhood. So again, when we're looking at maps, what assumptions are we making? What kind of politics and things are being embodied in the maps that are used? Another question that we think about and ask is, who is the map maker? Again, maps are embodying these agreements, these understandings, these contracts, and these negotiations. And then the map maker themselves has the power of representation, the power of scale, of symbols, the power to create this kind of social contract or this social construct that is, again, used as a way of a measure of power to take things from people, to obscure things from people. These maps don't represent the lived experiences of the people who have kind of suffered through the things that are happening in this this neighborhood for many, many years. So the map on the top, and I played a little video here of the demolition of the housing towers for the community, which was really a devastating thing for the people who lived there. And you don't hear it in the background, but people are like cheering. These are not the people who live there. These are the people, the developers and the housing authority cheering as these things come down. But when you like walk around the neighborhood, people are crying because this is their home. This is what they've known. This is their community. It's being wiped out before their eyes. So I thought this was an interesting map. This was supposed to be the dust and evacuation zone, where the dust from that implosion was supposed to fall within this zone and behave and not spread out to the neighborhood. But after that implosion, it was like a apocalypse. It spread way beyond this zone. And it's interesting because when you go back to the meetings and look at the transcripts from these meetings when they're talking about this process, and all you can hear is all these like really, deep concerns from neighbors of, how's this dust going to affect me? I'm elderly. Is anybody going to help me tape up my house? So this map represents none of that. It does not represent the lived experiences of people who had to go through this kind of implosion and deal with this. And again, this is another map of the zone, the target neighborhood, and it is a target in a very real sense, that where this eminent domain project occurred. So as part of this whole thing, I created I was able to get a fellowship that allowed me to open up a storefront called Community Futures Lab. And for a year, we documented this redevelopment, but also created a kind of community space where anybody could walk in, we were doing what we called oral futures interviews with people from the neighborhood to get their narrative and to get their stories, because again, when you go back and you look at articles about this whole situation, all you hear is from the housing authority, you hear from the government about their vision of the future of this community. You don't hear, and they went through a process where they had their little community meetings with people. They had a couple over a couple of years that solicited feedback, and I guess they're trying to apply some of that feedback. But again, largely, people were largely not involved or had access to this process or to the decision making that went into creating this. And so we opened the Community Futures Lab, and I'll talk more about some of the activities that we did there. But as part of this, I documented the redevelopment and construction, but also just did a lot of different things around looking at how, again, this neighborhood is represented. So one of the things that was really interesting is that I was playing around a lot with Google Maps around this time to see how Google Maps would change over the course of this project. And it was actually really interesting that when I started I would periodically Google map the neighborhood, and all these glitches kept coming up as I was trying to do this. And so it just had me really thinking about, one, surveillance, because for instance, you see the guy in the corner, and this idea, particularly surveillance on Black communities and how we're surveilled in these ways that are beyond our control. But also what I would also do with the pictures is always try to look for the camera and sort of turn the surveillance back in on itself. And so it's always interesting when you can find the camera and the shadow and the specter of this kind of surveillance happening in these communities. And again, people, their faces are blurred out, but it's a really just, it's gross in so many ways to me. But anyway, what's interesting is, again, thinking about how maps surveil, how Google Maps, what Google Maps is representing, how Google Maps can kind of erase history in some ways. And so it was really interesting over time to periodically see Google Maps begin to update and, in some ways lag behind their updates. So these buildings were imploded, but, maybe a couple months ago, I was still able to get these pictures of the old buildings. But then a few months later, those pictures are no longer there. So this on the right they're showing the new houses that they've built in the community. And so again, the middle picture is just these it's so interesting to me to just capture the camera in these pictures. But also another thing that's interesting is just, again, how these maps represent time, how the temporal layers that are embedded in even a kind of Google Maps kind of application, and how that uses maps to erase history and kind of present the history or the future or the present that they want to show for the people who are gentrifying and coming into this neighborhood. So they're no longer going to show those old, decrepit houses. And soon you're not going to see these Black faces in these pictures. You're going to see something totally different. And this is the Pearl, which was one of the really interesting things about this neighborhood is has such an amazing legacy of art, music, jazz. It was like a big jazz hotspot. You don't hear any of that in the narrative that comes out about this community. Again, it's this bootstrap narrative of the people themselves being to blame for what happened in this community. But again, part of the purpose of us doing these kind of oral futures interviews with people is both the future and the history. And you hear so much about the history and again, how it came to be this way that's left out of the story. So one of the things that happened in this neighborhood was there was this race riot that happened in 1964 on what is now called Cecil B. Moore Avenue, used to be called Columbia Avenue, and they changed the name of it after that. And those riots just took out the whole community. It was riots based on this woman who was apparently being brutalized by the police, and just really interesting backstory. And a lot of the people who live in this neighborhood were alive then, and it's just really interesting. But again, that history gets erased, and it just becomes about the present and blaming the people who live there. And these are some more pictures, and again, how these maps layer time is really interesting for me. So now just to talk about some of the map making practices that we engage in and that we engaged in as part of this project. I'll just play. I'll play a little video that talks about the project itself.
Community Futurism's Time and Memory in North Philly is a ethnographic research project exploring gentrification, displacement, redevelopment in North Philadelphia in particular. An iteration of the project has been the Community Futures Lab, which essentially functioned as what we call a living quantum time capsule, but it also had a gallery, a resource library. It functioned as a workshop space, art making space. It was pretty much anything, whatever the person who stepped in needed at the moment.
We had a conversation and said, hey, I think this would be very impactful if we situate ourselves right in the middle of the community, really at the point where it's experiencing rapid redevelopment, and be that kind of space and resource for that community.
And one of the projects we did as part of this was to work with community members to do like these kind of history walks and make sure we documented them. So this was one of them.
What you see, that's where it was. The image is on the page. This was Mr. Chip's ball. And up until maybe these years ago, I thought it was here when I saw it.
Oh, it's the same thing, they just covered it up.
Oh, you think that's what happened?
Yeah, see right there.
Right, but I thought I saw it a couple weeks ago. Well,
And that could be, her name is Faye Anderson, and she does a lot of work around jazz legacies and things like that. And she does these walks called Jane Walks that happen in various neighborhoods. And so she's done a couple of them in this particular neighborhood to talk about the legacy of jazz and all of the other things that were there. So as part of my practice in Black Quantum Futurism, one of the things that we do, again, we really think about this in a realm of time, and how can we reappropriate clocks and maps and these kind of things, because we also equate clocks to being a type of map as well. It's a temporal map. And how do we use them or reappropriate them to deconstruct these kind of Western space-times and dismantle what we call the master's clock? We create maps that embrace inherent tensions between space and time and that provide opportunities to reconfigure those things. And our practice includes primarily this thing we created called a quantum event map. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we also do these things called housing journey maps, sonic mapping, communal memory mapping. So I'll show a couple of examples of those kinds of things. So one of the things that we did at Community Futures Lab was to work with PHL Assembled, which was a sprawling collective art project that happened last year and included many, like hundreds of artists that were part of the city. And so one of the things that we did was to work with them to create this workshop called You're Now Here that happened in Sharswood at the North Philly Peace Park, which is a amazing farm and Peace Park community, and that's right across from the housing projects that were imploded, and they've been able to rebuild there. So anyway, we did a workshop there that had groups come together and make future vision maps of the neighborhood, and so they took a neighborhood walk and imagined and envisioned what should be there and not what is there, or those kinds of things, and worked together to create these kind of community maps of the Sharswood neighborhood. These are just some kind of questions that we ask when we're thinking about who gets access to the future, who gets to envision and imagine a future, thinking about how things like gender, income shift the means of access to the future. So these were kind of guiding questions when we're creating maps and clocks, and again, in particular in the Sharswood neighborhood, which is the background picture, and that's a map of Sharswood that was created by the community as a memory map. So one of these projects that we've done is this kind of community memory mapping that was actually developed. The exercise itself was developed by a Penn Law student who was interning with us from the architecture program. And basically it's what it says. It's a memory map, but it allows community members, again, to think about the layers of time, to think about how and where they've created memories that get lost in the kind of shuffle and of, when you're presenting a map of Sharswood, and again, what's embodied by that map. So being able to reappropriate that map and populate it with their own memories and their own histories. So we would have people like, where's a place where, you experience joy and those kinds of questions, or trauma, or those kinds of things. And so people populated the map, and I would take it to different community events and have people work on it. This was another kind of map that we had, but it was about space and time, and how do you map time for yourself. So one of the outcomes of this project, we were able to collect maybe 15 or 20 oral futures interviews. I'm still continuing to do these interviews with the community members. Again, I am very privileged to kind of live right in this community, and not in a sort of danger zone of where everything happens. I live about 10 blocks away from it, but the community registered community organization is my RCO, and so I've been just very privileged to be deeply involved with them and work with them through some of these projects. So one of the outcomes is we're going to, we've collected and taken thousands of pictures and gathered all these oral history interviews. We're going to create a map of the community that then populates it with those interviews, with those stories, with those photos, and we're working with the community to kind of think about the aesthetic and all of those different things. So it's not just me, making these decisions. This is a community kind of archive and will be accessible. And the hope is to kind of continue the workshop. So at the Community Futures Lab, we don't have the physical space anymore, but we crafted a series of workshops, including a thing called Housing Futures workshops that included housing rights information, as well as kind of this information about Afrofuturism and mapping and these kind of techniques. So we want to continue to do those and have workshops where we're incorporating this mapping and allowing people to access it in the workshop, and working with the RCO to do that. Is another just example of maps. This is a map that we did at the Community Futures Lab around New Year's, a kind of New Year's visioning session or vision board that we did with the community that was really beautiful. And it kind of converged with what was happening with the Trump administration and some things that were happening that were really challenging around housing and the future of like subsidized and public housing. And so we talked about that in this workshop and talked about what the future of housing looks like that is inclusive of everyone. We also would do workshops with these kind of housing journey maps where we have people just map the journey of their housing and kind of reflect on that and reflect on how their housing path has impacted their lives, has impacted their past, future selves, and all of those different things. And just really amazing stories come out of that when you just talk about where you've lived and how that impacts you. So we did these kind of maps, and they just ranged. Like some people like have stayed in North Philly all of their lives and never like really moved, but other people have lived Baltimore and came back and did different things like this map. And then we worked with a lot of community partners to do programming and workshops at the lab. And so one of the things that we did was we worked with a group of Penn students, again, Penn, y'all are in the house, to there was a group that was looking at this pre-civil rights activist and artist named Doc Thrash, who had a house, who lived in the Sharswood community, actually had 2 houses and just did amazing, amazing work. But again, this legacy of Doc Thrash is erased primarily, and there's a mural. The mural actually got covered up. There was actually 2 murals. One mural was actually on the side of his house, and it got painted over by HUD, the Housing, Urban and Development Department. And then there was another mural that's at 16th and Girard that was just recently partially covered, mostly covered by a new housing development, luxury or market rate housing development. So just, it's not even a metaphor, right? Like, we're being erased. So anyway, so this group of students are working to preserve Doc Thrash's legacy and his house, and working with and we've been I've been helping them as well, working with some of his descendants to try to preserve the house and take it back, because it's a mess in terms of the estate. So they came and did some workshops to give information to the community about Doc Thrash, and to kind of look at what the community looked like at the time of Doc Thrash and Sharswood today, and have people kind of do asset mapping around the different ideas and principles that Doc Thrash's legacy represents. And I really encourage you to look up. He like innovated this technique for painting, just amazing stuff. But again, you don't hear about this person. There is some of his artwork in the Philadelphia Art Museum and the I think the Photo Arts Center or something like that. But just it's unbelievable. But again, all you hear about Sharswood is how rough and dirty and all this stuff it is, and that legacy is left out. And then one of the really beautiful things that also came out of this project is that, and the ways in which it intersected with my legal work, was that at the time I was advocating for increasing low-income tenants' access to lawyers who can represent them in eviction court when they're facing eviction. And one of our council people created a hearing to talk about this. And one of the things that came out of this was people coming and doing these workshops where they created kind of posters and signs around these ideas and around housing as a human right, and actually came out to the hearing and showed up. It was just, my heart, like, it's just the ways in which they engaged with these ideas and took ownership over them. And again, you know, just having the space to be able to come in and say, this is messed up. Like, this is what's happening in my neighborhood. And maybe for me, it's not going to change, but I need to be able to talk about it and to have my voice heard. And so I use myself, you know, kind of as a medium in a way to try to get those voices amplified and to use my privilege as an attorney in the kind of spaces that I get to occupy and from that perspective to amplify. And so this was one of the ways in which that happened. And what came out of that was an amazing $500,000 to go towards eviction representation. And we created a program called Philly Eviction Prevention Project. Thank you. That now we're trying to get $3.5 million so it can be a universal access to counsel for every tenant who needs it, and we're working on that. So just quickly, a couple other maps that I'm working on. I recently created a project called Black Woman's Temporal Portal. This website you can find online, Black Woman, but woman with an X, so it can be inclusive of all women, not just cisgender women. And this project is actually going to be turned into a physical temporal portal that I'm working on building. Don't know where it's going to be yet, but there will be more information about it. But anyway, this website is meant to be a sort of temporal tool for women Black women to think about how we experience time and space in ways that are different or you know, sort of intersectional and modified by our identities. So it has this kind of map that faces it, and it's a map that you can go anywhere. It's a nonlinear kind of way of mapping things. And on that website, I have used Google to create a Black woman memory mapping of spaces in a city that feel safe or have felt safe for me as a Black woman, and other kind of spaces that you know, just honor and respect and Black women. So that's on that website as well. And this is just a kind of just close up of the quantum event map that we use. And again, part of the idea behind it is to kind of disrupt space-time and disrupt kind of this this focus on time as the primary factor of an event that you're experiencing. So what we have people do is think about either a future memory, something that they want, that is coming for them or that they want to see happen, or a present memory and how they map that, or a past memory or event and how they map that. And again, it's part of it is bringing in these ideas about how other cultures experience space-time, and particularly the African diaspora and some of those traditional ways of experiencing space-time that are nonlinear, and bringing in those kind of traditions. But again, like, time is just one part of the element of the event. So when you're mapping it out, you're thinking about all of these other elements that make an experience or make an event happen or make a memory. So we've had people map all kinds of things. So I do this in workshops, and sometimes I do it in groups where people map out a specific event. So this group in particular mapped out 9/11 and kind of used the map as a way of unpacking what that event felt like, what it smelled like, what it looked like, in addition to when it happened. So not thinking about the when as the most important element of experience. So we have people do that in groups, and that is actually another project that I worked on, and that's a map of that particular project. And then that one is a kind of like personal quantum event map. And so like I've had people map out things like their mother's death or the birth of their child, and just be able to like experience it from a new perspective, or think about things that they experience that they don't normally think about. Because when we think about things like smells can take us back into time, or it can take us forward, or it can bring us to a different time, or sounds can trigger different kind of temporal experiences. So just thinking about those things. And then finally, these are questions to consider when encountering maps and clocks, and these are things again that we think about, and I've written about to again start to think about what assumptions we're making when we encounter these things. So who's the map maker or clock maker? Who is the intended user? What's the purpose of the clock or map? What, if anything, on the map or clock is up for question? What's being taken for granted when you use it? What temporal landscape does the map or clock embody? When was it made? Does it still stand a test of time? What has changed? What has remained? Where are you in time when you're using the map or clock? What are the intersecting and conflicting temporalities that are pulled into your now or present when using the map or clock? What are the boundaries imagined or contested that they embody, and how can they be remapped, redrawn, envisioned to be more equitable in time and space? And again, what unspoken agreements, understandings, contracts, social constructs, negotiations are embedded. And then once we dismantle it, what takes its place? What already exists that we can learn from? What can we create? Thank you.
Like one of the things I think came up in a number of presentations was about like surveillance culture and how it matches up with like map making or the data, and I want to like ask about, I guess, like the messiness of that, right? Of like, by creating these maps or creating these networks and putting them out in public, or how is there a space to protect or like not overshare that can lead to it being taken up in projects where people are now targeting these networks or targeting this data to do something else with it. So thinking about like what should be shown and what doesn't need to be shown, and how you navigate that.
Speaking for myself, yes, think about that all the time. And I have to think about it also as an attorney. And so I'm very conscious of things like confidentiality and privacy and just personal experiences of surveillance and my community. So I'm very conscious of those things. And I don't think, as you said, it's super messy. You can't always avoid some of those outcomes and how data is used. And I think you have to go into it consciously with that, knowing that it's a messy process, and trying to build things into the process or project that helps to protect people. So I'm very conscious of that, and I try as hard as possible to involve the community in as much of it as possible. So it took, I gave a very brief presentation about the lab project itself, but it took a good 6 months to a year to even like build rapport with the community, build that kind of sense of trust, and build a kind of mechanism of communication that, I can communicate with them what I'm doing and not operate behind a sort of veil of secrecy until the outcome. So I've in inserted a lot of time into this process and don't see it as something that has an outcome by a certain date. It's an ongoing thing, and it's ongoing communication with the community to make sure I'm super respectful of everything. So even like the oral futures interviews, I haven't put them out anywhere yet until I've had an opportunity to talk to each person again, go through it with them, see what they don't want out shared, what they do want shared, whether they want to be anonymous, things like that. And I carry that into all of my projects as much as possible, but it is super messy, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, the messiness is really, I think, important and unavoidable. And I also think about it a lot. I will say for the Monument Lab, because we had the exploration phase, there were changes that we made. So asking age and zip code and not other questions was very much on purpose. And zip code it does feel invasive. It feels invasive when someone at the grocery store asks me my zip code. But it was like a sort of, all of the lab managers had a sort of like, never pressure anyone to give you any of this. You know, we don't care if they leave it blank. It's it's there. You don't need to ask for that information or follow up on anything for that. And we actually added this in the first version. We didn't have a way for people to give us their name because we didn't want because we were concerned about sort of stewarding that responsibly. And yet in the first one, we did ask people if they wanted their picture taken with their form. And in the second version, we dropped the picture taking. We felt like we didn't trust ourselves to make sure that we treated those 100%. This was respectfully. And so we just didn't take the pictures. But we did give people space, and we said sort of name, hashtag, or handle as a way of just trying to acknowledge that people were offering their ideas and they need credit for those ideas. We didn't want someone to end up with their picture on a T-shirt or something without credit for that. So that was little bit of balance. Like, we need people to get credit. They're offering ideas, and at the same time, we don't want to endanger people or. The only thing we did was sometimes people like children put their email addresses, so we covered those up. That was that just doesn't seem like a good idea. But I mean, that's that. I don't want to oversimplify it. It was really it was something we kept talking about. We kept having conversations about what responsibilities we had. And I'm not, I wouldn't say we got it perfect, but it was as you said, just continuing to make sure that everyone was comfortable.
I don't know if I'm understanding the question exactly. Everything was either opt-in and choice, or waivers and full transparency, and working outside of systems. And so when we aggregate data and information, to us it's power, not from a marketing perspective, which is funny because we're a creative agency, but from a perspective where it actually shows the voice of the voiceless, I think. And when you can combine numbers with storytelling and with all these extra sort of qualitative data, to me, it allows very underrepresented voices to have much more of a voice. But when it comes to surveillance, I don't think about that in terms of projects that we do. But I mean, I think about that personally. So.
And a geographer, and I did a research project in Jamaica in an informal settlement where people had been evicted but managed to negotiate staying. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about that relates to this question and to the presentations is about some of the gaps between what people said they were doing and what people were enacting. And I think that those had to do sometimes with narratives that allowed them to engage with various ways of legitimizing their possession of land that were offered by the state, as opposed to their enacted taking possession of land, which was not legal, right? And so one of the things that I was thinking about is how how do practices get lost when the way that people are presenting and the way that data is collected is through the narratives that people are like speaking. And along with that, because there's like this afterlife of data that you're talking about and some of the dangers of that, I was wondering about, because my anxiety is, well, if I then go and show the way that sometimes people's practices are more oppositional or more dangerous than their words, then I sort of run the risk of, it's like there's an opportunity there that, things can be built on, politics can be made out of those things, but also there's a danger in that I'm exposing, what is more sensitive.
I'm just going to answer because I'm not sure. I mean, I will say, I think in my work generally, like, protecting people feels more important than, and I think partially because I work in libraries and we libraries, archives, and museums have this notion of sort of the record being incredibly important, and the kind of, our whole work is devoted to ensuring access to information. And so I think that to some degree, as a corrective against that impulse, I spend a lot more time thinking about protecting information from harming people, protecting people from having an oversharing do them harm. But I don't know, I mean, I think because my whole career is devoted to basically this, a kind of information can empower people, and sharing and telling more stories and making sure more people have access is a good thing, that it's sort of my work is then not forgetting that, like, primarily don't harm anyone, don't put anyone at risk. That's so I'm not sure if that there's a, yeah.
Yeah, I think very similarly. And I think it's primarily the same answer I gave before. I think just my approach to it is that I don't feel any ownership over what I have. I just always try to recognize my privilege in even being able to get these stories or to hold them, and I try not to hold them for too long. So that's what it's about, and it's about, again, this just kind of this like clarity, and like also thinking about, like, sometimes I think, and this happens in my kind of day job, is just this idea that we always seek the good story and we always want to put the good story out because the good story is going to be what changes or what moves. But like, there's messy stories and there's not good stories that people still want to put out, and they want to tell their story. And so it's all about that. It's like, if you want to tell your story and that story is, maybe it is messy, maybe it is dangerous, but that is a choice that you can make. And if you decide not to make that choice, then I'm not going to do anything with this. You don't have to sit for this interview. So there was nothing for the Community Futures Lab, at least, it was all about you. It was all about, what did you need to get from it when you walked in? Did you want to have a Community Futures interview with me, or did you want to just get some literature and walk back out? Did you want to come in for this workshop for 5 minutes and see what it's about, and you hated it and you want to leave? That's up to you. Do you actually have a problem with what we're doing here? Express that. Let's talk about that as well, or let's not talk about it. Just come in and say you don't like what we're doing, or you're confused, and that's fine too. So just this like kind of openness, this flexibility. As in some ways, I like, as an artist, I think about these things and my moral place and ethics and all of these kinds of things, and just having a clear sense of it. And you don't always get it right. It is a lot of trial and error, and being okay with that. But I think being a conscious community member. Like, I didn't come into this project zooming in and saying, oh, I'm just dropping in to use you for my project. I actually lived there, and I actually had a stake in what was happening. And as an attorney, I represented people in that community. So I like to think I was coming from it from a different place. But also, again, being aware of my privileges and being aware of what I do get out of it, all those things. So I don't know if that answers it exactly, but yeah, so I think about it.
So I think maybe it's about thinking about things a little bit differently, and who does the data empower? Because I think the paraconstruct is the data empowers, people with a lot of agency within institutions and within organizations. I think the way that I think about data is how it can be actually used as a tool for people who need. more voice and more agency. And that's going back to, I think, what I constantly talk about, which is how information is exclusionary. And the fact is that, you know, when people don't know how to use that data, that's dangerous. And yet they're giving all that data. And the people who are expecting all the data know how to manipulate it. So to me, it's almost like, how do you shift that paradigm?